parliament, President Marcos Jr. described the Philippines as the front line, suggesting that the country is in a battle, and I quote, against actions that undermine regional peace. With China's increasing use of more aggressive measures such as lasers, water cannons, and even the outright ramming of Philippine Coast Guard vessels, the phrase frontline doesn't seem to be merely metaphorical. Are we edging ever closer to an armed encounter in the West Philippine Sea? Good evening, I'm John Nery and you are in the Public Square. I thought it might be helpful at this time to understand the situation in the West Philippine Sea from a non-military perspective. Our special guests tonight include a strategic thinker and an expert in international law. We are joined here in the studio by attorney Romel Bagares, a professor of international law at several institutions, including the Philippine Judicial Academy. And joining us online is Victor Andres Dindo Manhit, founder and CEO of the Stratbase consultancy group, and also a former professor of political science. Welcome, Attorney Romel and Professor Dindo, and thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Thank you, John, for having me tonight.
Thank you, John, and good evening to all your viewers.
Let me start with Professor Dindo. Are you worried about the situation, especially around Ayungin or Second Thomas Shoal, escalating? That's one. And number two, escalating beyond control?
We have to accept that there's a possible escalation, and that is not because of the Philippines, but because of the aggressive and coercive behavior of our northern neighbor, who claims to own islets, shoals, rocks based on historical arguments, which has been debunked by international law. So under a rules-based international order, we are simply asserting our rights, protecting our territorial integrity. But will it escalate to what we say an unnecessary encounter or conflict? This is where the engagement of President Bongbong Marcos comes in. I view, and from a strategic point of view, that as we engage with more countries that support our arbitral award, that support the definition of what is West Philippine Sea based on international law, and we are seeing that now on trilateral engagement, on quadrilateral maritime movements, exercises, and even joint patrols, not only with the U.S., but with other countries like Japan, Australia, Canada, and even EU countries. I look at that as deterrence. That you hope that if this goes beyond mere statements, support, but actions coming from these countries, it will deter China from being more aggressive on a long term.
We'll have a chance later to go back to this question of deterrence, but Attorney Romel, the other day, the Philippines, the US, Japan, and Australia conducted a joint maritime patrol. This is one of the initiatives that Professor Dindo referred to. In response, China announced that on the same day it conducted what it called combat patrols in the South China Sea. Should we view these latest developments with concern?
Well, definitely, because you see that one side does something and there's another response made by the other party. And my concern as a professor of international is really the legal side to the question. Of course, we are agreed that China has no legal basis with respect to its claims to historical, because its claims are based on historical title, which has been debunked by the arbitral court in 2016. But from the Philippine side, we also need to look at the legalities of our position with respect to the U.S. For instance, does the 1951 MDT actually cover what we consider our territories there, right? Is Pag-asa a territory from the perspective of the MDT? So we might be staking more than what might actually be legally allowed under our agreement with the U.S. But on the other hand, I agree with Professor Dindo here that we should actually expand, our scope. Because China is saying that we are just a mere stooge or a pawn from the U.S. side, right? And that's not true. But if we actually stake everything as if our interests are aligned with the U.S. on all fours, I don't think that's wise, because definitely the U.S. has its own interest in this dispute that might not be aligned with our own interest.
Yes, we'll have a chance also later to talk about U.S. interests and how they interpret the Mutual Defense Treaty. But for both of you, I'd like to ask first, can this dispute with China be managed? You can define manage any way you like, but the outcome I mean is no armed confrontation, no shooting war. No, Professor Dindo first, and Attorney Romel.
6 years of appeasing China, subservient to China during the 30 years, made us weaker, because we could have strengthened their positions since we won our arbitral award. China is actually executing what we call asymmetric warfare, gray zone, because they know in actual conflict with like-minded states, they have not really been tested. But with a small country that you can push around, which is the thinking of President Duterte during his administration, it works. That's why in an asymmetric warfare, popularly known by some, but not limited to the gray zone tactics, swarming, water cannon, not really strong enough to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty, not strong enough to invoke actual conflict. It tries to weaken your position. That's why my belief is really, surprisingly, our own president views the word differently, does not fall into the narrative trap of China-US interests. But based on Philippine interests, he has broadened our relationship. And countries have responded. No? And we have seen how they have responded. And I hope our own media gives importance also to what Australia has spoken about, Japan has spoken about, Canada has spoken about, the promise or commitment of European countries to move around the West Philippine Sea in partnership with the Philippines. So that kind of engagement by our own president, I believe, strengthens our capacity to deal with China. Because you'd rather deal with China from that position of strength. If you've noticed, China likes the word bilateral. And I also remind people, we all played school ground politics. There's always that big bully. What do you do when there's a big bully? Talk to him on the side of your school? Because China has its own interests. But for Philippine national interests, I think the interest is how do we protect our own territory, what is perceived that is ours, or not only territory, but exclusive economic zone. And the best way is to have the support of a broader group of nations. It's the narrative of China that brings us always to the US-China conflict. It's for the Philippines, it's basically somebody in our territory, in our exclusive economic zone, is preventing us from moving around there, from enjoying. And our own military, if you've noticed, have responded quite differently as compared to pre-2022, June 30, or that means before this administration. That means they were ready to respond. It was only the previous leadership of government, Duterte, that prevented them. Even Japan has been active in the National Coastal Watch with all their support. But we were not deploying these coast guards until this new government came in. So for me, these are actions. We have to be patient. This is a long game. And the broader relationship we have, the strong relationship we develop, not only with the US, is the key to maybe for China to respect us in the long term.
Professor Dindo, it can be managed through a combination of factors, including resolve on the part of the government, multilateral arrangements or partnerships, and then a change in the narrative, not buying into to China's claims. Attorney Romel, can it be managed, this dispute?
Well, I believe that we have to do it, right? But one of the first things that I would say about changing the narrative is actually why are we adopting U.S. language, rules-based order. That's a U.S. rules-based order rather than international law. The U.S. is not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It keeps on saying that they agree with customary international law, but it does not accept the entire legal regime that's embodied in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That is why they are using the phrase rules-based order, because that is not actually coextensive with what the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says. And that is why China can have some traction when it says that's actually a U.S. Policy, because the rules-based order is a U.S. doctrine, not international law. I think we should veer away from that idea of the rules-based order and instead insist, and we're actually saying that, right? But sometimes we adopt, most of the time actually, our pronouncements still reflect American foreign policy.
What would be the alternative?
The alternative is just really talk about international law and clarify. For instance, I tend to be worry and weary, in fact, of all these blanket statements saying atin ito. Because we know that the exclusive economic zone is not territory in the sense of territorial, in the sense of a full ownership, right? The problem is that if our people think in those terms, then the response would be emotive. The exclusive economic zone, economic rights. Of course, we are entitled to economic rights. And when we classify exclusive economic zone and understand it as if it were actually full territory, then the response required would be something equivalent to when you have a territory being invaded, right? But exclusive economic zone, in fact, there are different rules of engagement for that under international law. You can only use force proportionately, for instance, then you cannot start a shooting war there. There are cases already decided on that by various international tribunals. And that is why what I'm trying to say is, first we need to, of course this is something that we can do in parallel. How do we apply the arbitral award domestically? There are pending bills in the Senate, but from my perspective, I think that these do not really fully understand the implications of the arbitral award. So we need to first clarify to what extent do we have all these claims? What are the proportionate responses with respect to exclusive economic zone, to the territory, for instance? There are rocks there. They only generate a territorial sea. And beyond that, you already have the exclusive economic zone. We have not even defined our contiguous zone for that reason. And the problem is that our Navy or Coast Guard, because there's still no defined maritime zones, no exact metes and bounds, there's always the danger that a response intended for the exclusive economic zone would be seen as something else, right? So they would in fact instead use a response that is appropriate for the territorial sea. So those are two things. Right? Yeah. So number one, the language of the U.S. is different, should be different, should not be the one that we should be using, because that would give the China traction for its accusation that we are just a pawn in the bigger war between the two of them. And secondly, the legality really is something that should be front and center of our strategy, because that's what we started with the arbitral award.
Yeah, so for you, it can be managed, but you need at least these two factors. One is adopting an approach that is not American. And secondly, and I think you've written on this, right? Helping the Filipino public reimagine the Philippines under the terms of the arbitral award.
Yes.
I think that there's a difference, there's some nuances between the Treaty of Paris outlines and the arbitral award. So that would be part of the redefinition or the reimagining. But Attorney Romel, I think it's been clear, and ever since the term of Foreign Secretary Albert Del Rosario, they've really tried to plumb public opinion. And I think since at least 2012, public opinion has been very much in support of a more assertive Philippine stance. No? I see that as public support for this for the Philippines in this dispute with China. Professor Dindo, you wanna respond to
90% of Filipinos, if I'll follow what you're saying, John, according to Pulse survey, wanted Marcos to assert our rights. And if you've noticed the last 6 months of President Duterte, when he was building this narrative with all this propaganda machine on the Duterte legacy, you know what came out was a 70% Filipinos are thinking that Duterte was fighting China. Because of, remember, he started saying, I will not sign this, I will not do this, but all those things were really delayed because of a lot of missteps in our own government procurement, our own government bureaucracy was stopping it from proceeding. But he used it as if he took a stand. Funny thing is, we are talking about an aggressive China, but we're getting stuck with the US. I think we should talk about China itself. It has its own interest. If you look at the China Dream speech of President Xi Jinping, he defines this in 2049 that they will be the most powerful nation in this part of the world. Both in the first island chain, which is the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, and the Pacific Islands, the second island chain. That's why even India got surprised that it even extended to their border. So it became the 10-dash line. So we have to factor that in if we would like to deal with China.
Let's talk about China.
I mean, that's how that they have their own interest. And in their own interest, you just have to make yourself stronger. And to make yourself stronger is for, I don't even call ourselves a small country. I call ourselves, because as an institute in Australia called us a middle power, given our economic size, given all this possibility of partnership with us. Lowy Institute said that. So I'll build on that argument. As a middle power, how could we make ourselves stronger? And that institute is basically saying our strategic partnership, our cooperations with other countries. And it's not limited to the United States. Was it thinkable a year, 2 years ago, that there will be 4 ships in the West Philippine Sea? And all those engagement with Ayung and Shoal was not really limited because our government does not like to include other ships there yet. In my conversation with the military leadership, our partnership, but they're hoping that especially with a big military exercise through EDCA, I think the next few weeks, or even a broader naval exercise being envisioned by our own Philippine Navy, with other countries beyond the 3 that happened over the weekend, Australia, Japan, and the US, they hope that this really defines where we stand. And all these countries are helping us because based on international law, there are parts of this which are territory and there are parts of this which is our exclusive economic zone. The rules-based order is not simply being used by the US alone. It's being used by Japan, by the EU. Are we calling all those countries stooges of the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada? No? Because it's the order that came to follow after World War II, based on this international law in its different forms. So for me, we just have to focus on the reality that we're really dealing with an aggressive and coercive country that has only one objective, which is they will only accept us if we follow their way, which serves their own interests. That's how I...
Yeah, let's talk about China and also the issue of deterrence that you raised earlier, Professor Dindo. My question is, as you had already laid down the predicate, under Xi Jinping, it's a very different China. Is there an exit strategy for them? Or do we have to wait until the successor of Xi Jinping for some resolution to this?
There's no exit strategy for them because if you'd like to look at it, not from what we just see in our newspapers, but as also documents, as I've said, published by the leadership of China.
Yes.
Good to revisit really the 2049 China Dream. That they're the middle kingdom. We're all vassals of service. That's basically the message there. That's the message that they want to their people. Do their people believe it? Maybe no. But right now, 10 years of Xi Jinping has cleansed the leadership of the Communist Party of China from a different kind of thing. Because to survive, you have to follow the thinking of Xi Jinping. We used to have ambassadors from China who are ready to engage. But after 2013, we've seen Chinese ambassadors here simply mouthing the line of the president or the leadership of the Politburo. So how can we expect that? There's some consistency in that for the past decade already under his leadership. And that's what we need to factor in as we deal with China.
Attorney Romel.
Well, I agree that we should really confront China with respect to its claims. Because, we know, well, we would not have gone through the expense and the efforts of filing that arbitral case against China, if we don't believe in our own position on the fact that our position in the South China Sea respects international law. And precisely what I'm saying is that the public support is something that we should welcome, right? But I think that the people should actually understand what they're supporting, because what exactly does it mean? What is the extent of the West Philippine Sea claim, for instance? And what does it mean for us to be supporting the U.S. position? What are the risks and what are the costs of doing that? I think that's something that has not been explained to the people. The EDCA is used as a basis, it's explained to us as something else. But in fact, it's actually, in a word, a preparation for a major conflict, not just with respect to the South, to our claims in the South China Sea, but even with respect to Taiwan, right? And my concern is that, for instance, Taiwan, the Mutual Defense Treaty does not cover Taiwan, definitely. Right? It's not U.S. territory, and in fact, we have a one China policy. Now, we're not saying that we should just stand by, look by the sidelines. But what I'm saying is we should really clarify with the U.S. Our treaty provisions there, and to be clear about it, to actually amend it to include Taiwan, for instance, because we might be pushing ourselves into something that we're not prepared for, and that we're not ready to take the risks for the public, because the public might not even be aware of the risks that are involved. So I think that what for us, it's good that the president is doing that now, right? And I have a record of criticizing the Duterte administration for its subservience to China. But I think that my position is that our projections, our assertions of our rights in the South China Sea should be well defined, should be founded on clear legal rules, and that when our position is clear legally, then we minimize the risks of escalation. Because it seems to me right now that everything is actually defined militarily. Look at the recent issuance in Malacanang, supposedly putting together under one house, our issues, our West Philippine Sea response. But if you notice, the DFA is just a member of the committee. It's actually the DND that's on top of everything. What does that tell us? It's actually a military response. It's the military response it's apparent to me that it's the DND that will be calling the shots with respect to policy on the West Philippine Sea, and not the Department of Foreign Affairs, which should not be the case. The DFA is just a member of the committee, and it's the DND that chairs the committee.
Professor Dindo, do you have a different take on that?
Actually, the chairman is the executive secretary, Bersamin. And there's just the secretariat is within the office of the president. It's just a retired former chief of staff, Filipino. That's my understanding of my discussion with the defense establishment. So they're simply a member also. But for me, let's not limit it really to the Mutual Defense Treaty, because our own legal opinion coming from partners, fellows in our own institute, in Raul Pangalangan, Justice Tony Carpio, who have been guiding also the military in the way they do these things. I think they all share that there's clarity in terms of what we should develop and assert. I surrender to them on that. Me, I'm on the strategic side. And on the strategic side, I think our own military has their own team that knows what is the boundaries of their treaties. That's why it's not limited to the Mutual Defense Treaty. We have a strategic partnership with Australia. We're working on a random or reciprocal, not random, but reciprocal access agreement with Japan that allows them to also work with us in this part of our territory or exclusive economic zone. So I believe there are actions that can be taken by the DFA, and they continue to engage China, especially if you get to talk to ambassadors who've been assigned to the Chinese embassy, how the concept of dealing with them has always really been hard, or even in the ASEAN level, because they have their own interests that they continue to push. You just have to really just make a stand and push back based on what you hold on to. And I think the DFA has tried to play its role on that part. But at times, you need to position yourself also, because there's a demand coming from the public, and I've always respected the Filipino public, and you've known that, John, even people don't question at times the result of surveys, but me, I've always believed we're simply asking what the voters think. So I respect them, just like public opinion survey based on West Philippine Sea. Because that's the only way we know. And me, as a professor of political science, I've always believed government exists for the Filipino people. And as we try to educate them, remember, the concept of West Philippine Sea did not exist in 2012 until it was used by the administration of Pilipinas. But now it cuts across our own demographic and geographic divisions in this country. Because we see them mentioning it. Maybe it's emotional. It's not a top concern based on economic and job and income issues. But when they talk about West Philippine Sea, they want their government to do something about it. And when we ask this question, we got surprised when the first time we asked why. It is not about military issues. It's about protecting our fisher folks. So even communities that are not part of the fishing communities feel that it's about protecting our fisher folks. Second, it's about protecting our marine resources. So, and they understand that because we have used multiple surveys by Pulse Asia, trying to extract those information and also social weather station, but we get the same support numbers, no? As far back as 2012, right before we filed the case in 2013, and we have done this twice a year under our institute. So for me, government simply needs to build on where the people feel that they want government to do. But they have to do it with the expertise that government are supposed to have. That means from a legal. That's why for me, I even found it weak that when the executive order came out, why is the chairman the executive secretary? And mere members, DFA, DND. Maybe the president wanted adult supervision from a legal point of view, since he's a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But they created a new office, that was a secretariat, that has a military background as training, but filled up with civilians now also. Again, headed by Centino. But it's something that we all need to prepare for, because that's why we call it strategic studies. You just have to anticipate what conflict could be, and how can you best address conflict by whatever resources, forces that is within your access, maybe, like partnership. And that's where we are now, because I said we lost 6 years. It's a catch up. And imagine a strong China simply looking at, look, this country was subservient to us. What happened? So for me, the way they read it, they can push back, and the Philippines will just turn over again. Maybe that's what they're hoping, because they have the luxury of time. That's the nature of communist dictatorship. They have a luxury of time because they're controlled by a party, and in this case, the party leadership does not even like to change leadership for the past 10 years. It has changed the rules of leadership. Right. So that's what we're dealing with. Accept that reality and prepare for that reality. And hopefully, with that kind of acceptance of that reality, we can ensure peace and stability in the free and open Indo-Pacific. I'm using the term because that's the term of Japan. Because now every time you hear a free and open Indo-Pacific, people misunderstand it as a Biden term. But no, it was an Abbott term as early as 2007, 2008. And that's what these countries are simply continuing. And with the help of our arbitral award, they found international law precedent to support a country like the Philippines that they consider of strategic importance. Not because of Taiwan, but because of the trade routes that passes through Bashi Channel, that passes through Luzon Strait, which is part of or adjacent to our EDFE sites, or even because of the submarine cables entering places like Aurora, exiting in La Union. That's important in the data flows moving forward. And other submarine cables, landing areas that passes through the Philippines and passes through Pacific to the West Philippine Sea to South China Sea. So there's that strategic value. And for me, let's make the most of this strategic interest and get them to engage with us, support us. No?
I want to take I want to take a step back, and I think it's important that Professor Dindo, you highlighted the non-military stakes involved here, no? The economic livelihood of fishermen, the maritime resources, and so on. But I think right now there is a public concern about escalation as far as Ayungin Shoal is concerned, right? With the rotation and replenishment sorties. Attorney Romel, you said earlier, you questioned U.S. interests, right? And whether they are in fact ready to invoke the MDT. I've noticed that in 2012, with that standoff in Scarborough, we waited on the Obama White House, and they were very guarded with their assurances. But I think that under Biden, the assurances have been very, very specific, right?
Big difference, John.
Sorry?
The arbitral award made a big difference.
The arbitral award.
U.S. cannot side with us at that time because it was disputed territory. But after that, all these countries that are supporting us is invoking that for the reason to support us. And that's, again, based on conversations with our leadership in government, but also based on my conversations with leadership of visiting people from those countries.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
My question is, from the point of view of China, Attorney Romel, is the American assurance that they will invoke the MDT if something happens to Filipino sailors on Ayungin Shoal, is that a credible assurance from the perspective of China?
Well, first, I'd like to clarify that the arbitral award did not actually adjudicate on who owns which territory. It only clarified the status of the features. And as far as I know, I think until now, the U.S. does not actually say that it supports the Philippine territorial claims there. There's no such thing. The statement only says that they view that the MDT applies to armed forces, Philippine armed forces, personal assets, vessels, including Coast Guard vessels. That's the statement that they said. And that's, of course, I agree that there's a change in the way the Americans have viewed the South China Sea question after Obama, because Obama was more for appeasement, which was actually bad for us because we were waiting for Obama support when the Scarborough Shoal actually came into play. The issue there, no? But Obama did not really make any strong statement in support of the Philippine position in the Scarborough Shoal. Now it's different, but that a credible deterrence is one thing, right? But as and to me, it's a good thing that the U.S. Somehow changed tune with respect to the coverage of the MDT. That it's now clear that they interpret that as covering Coast Guard vessels, for instance, and armed forces. But I think it should be clear that the U.S. until today has not said anything different from its position in the 1970s, that it will not support any territorial dispute claims with the Philippines in the South China Sea. So in other words, our position on Pag-asa Island, that we own it, that's not the scope of U.S. foreign policy. It's simply that our MDT with them would apply to armed forces vessels, to troops. And it's a different question, for instance, if the Chinese, say, invade Pag-asa. Now, the question would be, would that trigger the MDT? Right? We're still on the gray zone on that because the Pag-asa, as is a Philippine territory from our position, but official U.S. foreign policy does not say as much, right? And I think one of the things that we should also consider from the point of view of international law is, and I think that we're already doing this, right, to document every Chinese response. Because our problem really now is, can we characterize what China is doing as armed attack? And the current international law, armed attack would involve, some deaths, would involve sizable damage to property. That's the definition of armed attack under current international doctrine. But the use of water cannons, what's that? But if actually we lump them together, the use of laser over a period of time, perhaps we can make a case, right? And the problem is that, in most of our international tribunals, or the basic principles of our international tribunals is consent. But we have examples, the case of Nicaragua, for instance, where customary international is binding on all states, right? And we can perhaps craft an argument. So if they are fighting us asymmetrically, we should do likewise and continue what we did in the arbitral case and try to make a case that what China is doing is actually armed attack, and we would like the courts to say that this is armed attack, given the long history, given what China has been doing to undermining the international law through its actions.
I get the impression, it may be a misimpression, that the United States is less willing to invoke MDT when it comes to Pag-asa, much more willing these days when it comes to Ayungin Shoal.
Well,
tama ba yun?
Well, it's because, I think, aside from the strategic position, right? Well, you have a naval vessel there, it's quite clear, right? But the thing that we should not really, we should be clear on is that the U.S. does not support Philippine territorial claims in the West Philippine Sea. It has no such pronouncement officially. And that should give us pause.
But, Professor Dindo?
Sorry, I'm quite confused on that, because I think that's the thinking of some legal scholars and statements coming from the Trump administration in terms of support after the arbitral award. So I'm not a legal scholar, but I'll surrender to that.
Yeah, I would like to see receipts. Is there any written statement from the U.S. saying that they support it? There's none. The MDT only says that if and they said this, they clarified that if Philippine troops are attacked, vessels are attacked, then MDT will apply.
Okay, Professor Dindo.
Also, for me, it's hard to argue on that, no. But I cannot. My understanding from briefings I get from international law scholars, they view things differently. That's why they're out and out there. A lot of law professors, supporting that there is a position for the U.S. And that's why we have this constant visit, even during the time of Trump.
So, can I ask my...
So what is their basis for committing all those things? Then you have, with the president, you have Blinken, you had Austin, you had the Vice President Kamala Harris, you had the visit to... So for me, I don't know that much. I don't claim to be an expert. But Ayungin Shoal is no different from Pag-asa because there's a military base in Pag-asa Island.
I think it's freedom of navigation, really, which is the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. They need free passage through international waters. That's all that the U.S. is interested in, and not our territorial claims in the West Philippine Sea.
Professor Dindo, can I ask you the same question I asked Attorney Romel earlier? In your view, does China see American promises to invoke MDT if something happens in Ayungin Shoal as credible, and will that deter China?
Yes, they are credible. And my sources are actually diplomats who have engaged with China. And also, the arbitral award is taken seriously by China because they panicked when we won the arbitral award. Then again, my sources are Japanese diplomats, Korean diplomats, Australian diplomats. People are concerned with what's happening in this part of the world. That's why they wanted the government to make a stand as early as 2016. So I'm not watching it from different perspective. I'm basically saying, and you have seen our work, John, through the years. That's why we have a lot of engagement with some of these diplomatic missions, because when they want to say something, they do it through our institute. That's why even India announced their support for the Philippines in our institute's conference last July. A follow-up on a possible cooperation with the Philippines in November, and a follow-up last February with triangular with Japan. The U.S. was stating these things through our institute and Japan also. So I believe that they had a reason for saying that. It's clear. It's very clear for them what we got through the arbitral award, and maybe from there is building their support and partnership with us. Even the strategic partnership with Vietnam that has evolved into really a strong relations now under the administration of Marcos, because they wanted meetings. According to the leadership of the diplomatic department of Vietnam during the time of Duterte, they did not like to engage because they wanted to stake that claim. That's why the ASEAN even used the term rules-based order in their ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, because it's the safest way for Cambodia and Laos to sign and support the Philippines because of the relationship that they have with China. So all these things are happening because of the actions that we took under the Aquino administration, and we won internationally, and they're all responding to it. So I think they see something in those things, no? I think even the U.S., that's why for some of my engagement, every time I see a visitor, they always ask me, how come it's only in Philippine media, sorry to say, John, that we get to be asked if we're committed? The Japan media does not ask us when we talk about Senkaku. The Korean media does not ask us. Maybe I always joke with them, of course, not to downplay the Filipino people, that we're free, maybe that's too free for that. But nobody discusses these things in open. That's why maybe we're not privy to the actions also of our own government, because this is national security already. So we're all relying, no, on what we read in the newspaper. But me, on my case, I try to rely on where the Filipino people feel, because that's the role of institutes like ours, and hope to shape public policy to a certain direction. And right now, that's what we're seeing consistently. 9 out of 10 Filipinos does not like the Marcos administration as of last December to work with China in resolving the West Philippine Sea, because they believe China cannot be trusted. That went up from 8 out of 10 to 9 out of 10. And that's where I'm coming from, with the hope that these friends of ours, these allies of ours, can be relied on. And on our part, we have stopped looking at China, because have you ever dealt with China? There's only one person who dealt with Xi Jinping one-on-one when he was vice president. That's Albert de Rosario. And I'm privy to that discussion as part of his institute. We knew in 2012 that the Philippines will be bullied the moment he becomes president. And that's what we saw in 2013. So these are not just incidents. These are tactical actions. That's why our only recourse at the time, because that was what this international committee asked us, have a stronger position based on international law. That's why a case was filed by Albert Rosario. Even when part of DFA did not like that. Even when part of the Aquino government was afraid of China. And that's why we're here now, given that decision. So at times, it takes a different kind of thinking. Not accepting how weak we are, but thinking that in this battle of asymmetric warfare, you can play with all your games. Now, let's deal with China bilaterally. Let's talk about the whole world, how we can question the motives of other countries instead of harnessing them. That weakens our position. And China enjoys that. That's our problem. So for me, I believe we should simply know what our security threat is. Not the US, not Japan, not Taiwan, but China. They're the one being aggressive in our exclusive economic zone. They're the one being aggressive in our island or territory. And they will not stop. That's a problem with ASEAN. They're happy with what we did. They invoke the arbitral award in some of their statements in the UN late. Malaysia have used that. Singapore uses a different word, but invokes basically the rules that we won there. Even Indonesia. But they wouldn't not like to stand up because the economy is tied up with China. And that made us different from the ASEAN countries. Did it weaken our economy? Not really. Because we never got anything. 0.9% after the end of the Duterte administration with investment coming from China. And it even went down.
Professor.
Past 2 years. So at the end of the day, it's about our interests. We protect our interests. We make ourselves stronger. And we don't doubt people who offer, or countries that offer us support. That's where we're coming from. And we've been consistent about this since 2012, since that conversation with Xi Jinping, Vice President Xi Jinping. And I even traveled in 2012 to Beijing after that Xi Jinping one-on-one with a delegation of Filipinos, both public and private. Because we know it's not China itself, but it's the leadership.
So how do we
As we
stop
project-
China?
That's a reality. You cannot approach China because China has a different thinking. They have their own national interests. So don't deal with them as a weak nation. As I've said, deal with them as a middle power. Not strong enough against China, but make yourself stronger with other countries that share your values in this so-called rules-based order because we follow international law.
Gentlemen, we're running a little long. Allow me to ask you maybe just a couple more questions. Attorney Romel, you wrote the Philippine chapter in the Oxford Handbook of International Law in Asia and the Pacific. Is there a resource or an opportunity in international law that the Philippines has not yet fully capitalized on to help resolve this dispute with China?
Well, as what I said earlier, the difficulty is that it's a consent-based system. We were able to actually win because the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has a mechanism that binds parties with respect to disputes on the interpretation and application of the convention, right? And I'm all agreed with Professor Dindo that we should actually approach things from a multilateral perspective rather than a bilateral one, which means that we will never win with China if we accept the bilateral approach, right? And I also agree that we're not a small country. Look at the demographics, projections for the size of our population, our economy in the next 10 years. Definitely we can classify ourselves as a middle country. And for international law, I think that my position has always been we should actually be very clear about what we won in the arbitral award. Because for me right now, people pay a lot of, they heap a lot of praise on the arbitral award, but they don't really understand what it actually has as an import, has given to us. As I said, the clarification of our position, we have not fully capitalized on that. We have not actually implemented domestically. We even have a decision in the Supreme Court 6 years later after the arbitral award that contradicted what the arbitral award said, right? So these things we need to, clean up our house and see if there are things that actually contradict what we say to be the lodestone of our case internationally, which is the arbitral award. So that's really one thing that for me is really important. Clarifying of maritime zones, to what extent is our claim to the exclusive economic zone consistent with the arbitral award, for instance? Because until today, we're still saying we're still talking about a fully entitled exclusive economic zone when our position in the arbitral award was something else, was different. And we need to specifically identify the rocks, the islands that we claim as ours, and actually name them in laws. Because that's now the intertemporal law as far as the arbitral award is concerned. But I'm seeing that the Senate versions do not even name these islands. We have not actually learned from what we won in the arbitral award in that sense.
Thank you. Professor Dindo, you've served in government as undersecretary, you've worked with international consultancies, you run a renowned think tank. Now, if you were to advise the Philippine government on finding a resolution to the crisis in the West Philippine Sea, what would you recommend?
It's moving forward with credible deterrence, multipolar world. That means this issue should not be seen from the lenses of China and the US, but should be seen in the lens of there are middle powers like Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, EU countries that share our values, or even India, that's very independent. But as we look at it that way, we should strengthen our own cooperation. Then the US becomes simply one of that cooperation. And if you want to test them, and maybe in a less, I can whisper among the three of us when this is not being recorded, it's us that has been limiting the actions of these nations, according to my conversation with the leadership of these nations, the representatives here when they visit. So they're waiting for us to ask them, can we do joint patrol? Because joint patrol is different from exercise. So there's a big difference. What we saw over the weekend is simply exercise. But if we make that joint patrol, patrolling our exclusive economic zone, patrolling our West Philippine Sea territory, then maybe China will take this thing seriously. But it's us. Our government doesn't really like to escalate this, based on my conversation with leadership. So hopefully, we don't approach it from the lens of the U.S., China interest, but we have to look at it from Philippine national interest.
Last question, gentlemen. Professor Dindo first, and then Attorney Romel. One or two milestones to look at for in the next few months?
Me, the milestone is we see this conversation happening this week with the U.S.
That's right. Yeah, the White House Summit,
As not simply limited to national security. It has to involve economic security. And hopefully all the conversations of President Bongbong Marcos Jr. leads to that also. Not only national security, but also what I call economic security. Investments that can create jobs. Investment that can improve the livelihood of our people, because it's a win-win for both sides. They invest, they get their market, they get their product, but in our case, we create jobs. But on one hand, imagine if we have more investors here. Will China dare do anything drastic against us? We call that in strategic studies accidents. The death, the attack on a factory, or a misaccident, or a miscommunication that will lead to an attack. That brings other countries, especially. That's why for me, more open economy with all these foreign groups investing in our country should always go side by side with national security, because that strengthens our position globally.
Thank you, Professor Dindo. Attorney Romel?
I think I'll focus my attention on EO 57, which created to supposedly stimulate our response. I think one of the first things that it should consider is actually lift the moratorium on oil exploration in the reed bank. Because until now, the moratorium has not been lifted. It was imposed during the Duterte administration, and we're now facing a huge energy security with the Shutdown of Balampaya. It's something that the government seems to have forgotten, that it has imposed a moratorium, and that's actually, that does not, unfortunately, that goes against what we won in the arbitral award. There's a decision there that reed bank is part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Why are we stopping our oil explorations there? That to me would prove that EO 57 is something that's really effective now, because it can actually move things forward from our perspective.
Thank you. Stratbase CEO Victor Andres Dindo Manhit and international law professor Romel Bagares, attorney Romel Bagares, for an eye-opening and deeply argued discussion. Many thanks to both of you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Attorney Romel.
Thank you, Professor Dindo.
That's it for us tonight. The next step for engaged citizens, as always, is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.